Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, April the 16th. Postal voting is underway, meaning that the local and devolved elections just got real. What happens in the coming days now really matters to the outcome. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. National and international events have diverted our focus through much of this week, but today it's a good moment to come back to the biggest pressing moment in 3 weeks' time in our politics. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, which today is about populism, messy results and messy tactics.
Well, indeed, and there's a particularly nasty row in Scotland between the leaders of Labour and Reform. Both sides are calling each other liars.
All about what might happen after polling day. Meanwhile, the hours after the results in Wales could also get messy if it's a close result, I've discovered. Apparently, Reform have been studying recent examples of unusual election outcomes. So more on that in a moment. And stopping dirty politics in its tracks is the Electoral Commission's number one mission now. They've begun trawling the internet for deepfake election and political videos. But by contrast, you've been having a much more wholesome journalistic experience, haven't you, Anne?
Yes, I take it to the high level, Sam. I've been sitting down with the German ambassador in her first interview since she started in London. And she's been making friends with Andy Burnham. More on that Manchester moment in just a bit.
I dread to think if the German ambassador in London hadn't given you her first interview. Everywhere I go as well, though, the subject of Andy Burnham's ambitions comes up. There's a tale out this morning, I think it's from the New Statesman, about how he could, in a nuclear move, resign, this is sort of after May elections, resign the Manchester Metro mayoralty first and then apply for a Westminster seat. And that would all be to get round that Labour National Executive Committee block on the wanting the mayor to stand down, to nix that problem straight away and then go for a seat. Then maybe that could be a path through. I am absolutely sure we will get denials on that from Andy Burnham and his team. But I think at the very least, it's a symptom of the renewed focus on him, perhaps as some of the other candidates struggle in Westminster.
Indeed, and clearly getting on the radar outside the country as well, which I think Andy Burnham will be quite pleased about. It's a bit of an in-between day in Westminster ahead of Keir Starmer heading to Paris tomorrow for his summit with Emmanuel Macron about the Straits of Hormuz. The government is making the announcement you previewed yesterday, Sam, to cut electricity prices for some businesses, although it does seem that some of the business groups are disappointed with the scale of that.
Yeah, with electricity prices at such a high level, it's not clear that they think that this will be enough. Meanwhile, The Times has a story on a theme that we've covered a lot on this podcast about where contingency planning is in government, caused by the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. And it's a cracker of a story by Aubrey Allegretti. They talk about a reasonable worst case scenario. That's a phrase that we used to hear a lot in Brexit days, in the food industry, because of course, one of the things that as we talked about already, the consequences of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz is a shortage of carbon dioxide.
Exercise Turnstone raises the possibility that Britain could face shortages of goods like chicken, pork, and other supermarket stocks this summer if the war in Iran should continue. That's assuming that the Strait of Hormuz haven't reopened by then. As you say, Sam, it does remind us a bit of that Brexit no deal kind of planning, which does cause a bit of anxiety.
The tendency of ministers on this subject of contingencies has been ever so slightly Captain Mannering, not to really acknowledging in public that there could be any problem. That on the one hand, that's possibly sensible for public opinion management, but on the other European countries in particular have been making earlier more obvious preparations on this. And the list of things that could be affected is quite something when you consider CO2 is used to help prolong the shelf life of foods such as salads, packaged meats and baked goods. It's used in the process of slaughtering nearly all pigs and 2/3 of chickens. And critically, for beer lovers, breweries would also be hit because the gas is used to make drinks fizzy. In response to the story, the government this morning pointed out that actually Business Secretary Peter Kyle did unmothball a carbon dioxide plant in Teesside by giving it a large grant, about £100 million, to keep the CO2 supply going. But it is an issue and it's not one that's going to go away.
And quite some fizz in Scotland as the gloves came off there in the Channel 4 leaders debate on Tuesday evening and the aftermath. And a reminder that the scrap north of the border in those May elections is going to be dramatic one way or the other. Reform UK's leader, Malcolm Offord in Scotland, alleging that the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sawar, came bouncing up to him at an event last December and had suggested that they work together to remove the SNP from power. Well, Sawar then trounced that as a desperate lie from a desperate man. Is it just fisticuffs happening there for the cameras, Sam, or is it something more?
Well, Reform UK have made this allegation, both the leader and one of the senior candidates, that Anna Sawar engaged in conversations about what happens after the elections in terms of possible working together. Everybody's calling each other a liar, so we obviously can't sort of call it as to who's telling the truth. But what it does absolutely show you is that we could be in for quite a roller coaster in the immediate aftermath of the devolved elections. So just a reminder, we had a YouGov MRP polling projection at the end of last week. And what that told us is that at the moment, under their projection, the SNP get an overall majority in most, but not all scenarios. So we could be in for a hung parliament, and then there's the question of which party gets to take the first minister job with the help of others. So there could be discussions between the parties in order to get you over the line. Then now the convention is that the leader of the largest party is elected, and the Scottish Labour and Liberal Democrat contingents hope the election results mean that they could collectively have enough MSPs to elect Anas Sawar with the help and support maybe of the Conservatives.
But with Reform expected to win up to 10 seats at Holyrood, that does raise the prospect that Offord could hold the balance of power there, forcing Sawar to accept Reform's support as the price for getting into Bute House. Now, some Labour figures have even speculated privately that that could be necessary. So what's interesting about this, Sam, is it's led senior Labour and Lib Dem sources to tell The Guardian that they would never court Reform votes. They said that they believed Malcolm Offord would abstain if such a scenario were to arise to avoid supporting a new Labour administration. And in that case, if that were the case, then John Swinney would win. So everyone is playing games, pre-games here before the vote. But I think it does underline how the various outcomes are far from certain to play out north of the border. Nigel Farage is in Wales today. Does it look a bit similar there?
Well, listen, there are echoes of that over in Wales. Because the thing about Scotland and Wales is they both have proportional voting systems. So small movements in voting patterns can make huge differences to the final results because they've both got list systems, sort of super constituencies. But what I've been picking up is what might happen in Wales. So there, at the moment, the latest YouGov MRP has plied on the most seats and Reform second, although Reform are pretty bullish about their position. But I want you to consider a scenario in Wales where we could end up with a party with the most seats different to the one for the most votes. And now, while the concept of a popular mandate, party with the most votes, doesn't have any sort of constitutional legitimacy, it shouldn't mean anything under the way we do our politics. It has started to, particularly in recent years, post the Brexit vote. So I want you to imagine this scenario, Anne, where Reform in Wales get the most votes, but not the most seats. What happens then? And here's a little fact for you, a mini scoop for you. I've learned that Reform have been studying what happened in 2007 in Scotland as a model of what they, could do. I mean, it all depends on the results, but Nigel Farage is actually more of a student of history than commonly realised, because in that 2007 election, the SNP was the largest party on 47 seats, but the Lib Dems, who'd been working together with the Labour Party, together combined got way, way more seats. And so in that scenario, what happened in 2007 is Alex Salmond just moved really fast. He just acted quickly, seized the agenda and announced he was going to be First Minister immediately. And that basically worked. And he went ahead for the next few years succeeded in running a minority administration. So there is a blueprint for what might happen or what has happened in such a scenario in other devolved elections that I can tell you, Anne, Reform are studying very, very closely. Whether that would work now, far from clear that they think it would. But I think like those cameras are going to be rolling possibly into Saturday morning when that Welsh result starts to finally emerge.
Wow, fascinating that could even potentially be a scenario. I'm also struck, having known Alex Salmond back in the day, the late Alex Salmond, the idea of him having an impact as a model for Nigel Farage in Wales from his afterlife. I think he would have found, I don't know, amusing or worse, I'm not sure. Also, you mentioned that this could be a deepfake election, to keep our eye on that, Sam.
Yeah, I actually went to see yesterday the chief executive of the Electoral Commission, Vijay Rangarajan, and he is launching a massive drive because of a big threat to our politics that the Electoral Commission can spy, and that is the use of deepfake AI videos disrupting elections. And he's beginning right now a big pilot in this election campaign to warn and sort of catch them and work out how our politics respond to quite a lot of slightly unresolved questions on lots of fronts on this. So we have seen AI fake videos really starting to pop up at election time all around the world. There were a lot in the Hungarian elections, he was telling me, including people spoofing Sky News, thousands and thousands of kind of dodgy accounts seeking to sort of condition public opinion. But even closer to home, there have been some mega examples of this. And there was one in particular in the Irish presidential election that seems to have spooked everybody in the kind of electoral administrator world. And that was a fake video of a real candidate, Catherine Connolly, who was spoofed saying that she was pulling out, resigning from the election. And even though only tens of thousands of people saw that before it was taken down, immediately everybody had to come out and say, this is a fake. This is to pause the election. There had to be a big moment to make clear that was a spoof. And that has just prompted the question, what if something like that happened in a UK election? We have elections underway, so they're getting in there first, the Electoral Commission, and setting up a bit of the monitoring system. I was playing him that video, and so I wanted you just to listen to this section of the chat.
We've seen some horrendous examples in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, really around the world. The one that really struck home for us was in the Irish presidential election last year, a deepfake of one of the presidential candidates apparently withdrawing from the election race.
It is with great regret that I announce the withdrawal of my candidacy and the ending of my campaign.
No, Catherine!
What's your thought on that? First of all, it's incredibly believable. It would put off some voters potentially going and voting. And that's what we really don't want to see in any British election.
And what's your lesson from seeing that?
You've got to move very quickly. So our system will be running all the time. It's going to try to catch these deep fakes before they've spread too far.
So what was interesting is the Electoral Commission are doing all of this, but they're at the foothills of discussions with the political parties and with social media companies. And so that's two sets of negotiations about kind of people signing up to, what at the edges could be some pretty hardcore principles. And they think broadly that they can get to a place where the parties sign up to a code of conduct, though there are some difficult issues there, and there's some tough negotiation to be done because parties never want to tie their hands too much. But I actually detected some pessimism that they could get the social media companies to promise to take down fake stuff in quite the same way. Some social media companies, he made clear, behave quite well, but others do not. Now, he wouldn't name and shame which social media companies allow the fake stuff just to spread. But clearly there are some. And just that line, it's a difficult job he's got, because that line between misinformation and things like satire. We see a lot of satirical videos of Keir Starmer, which he made clear were absolutely fine. He wasn't going to get in the way of debate. It's particularly things like candidates pulling out, lies about elections being cancelled, polling stations being moved, and all of that. That's their primary focus. But at the fringes, this is quite a difficult and hard yards debate. But it's fascinating that they're in that space. I think we're going to hear a lot more from him in the months ahead on this.
And it's a reminder of the long tail of that election in Hungary at the beginning of the week that ousted Viktor Orban after his very long stay in power. Playbook picks up Tory leader Kemi Badenoch's interview with our CEO, Matthias Döpfner from Axel Springer, the owner of Politico, I should say. And he does an interesting interview series and sat down with Badenoch. She was arguing that right-wing populism had peaked, leaving room for her brand of centre-right economics to reassert itself. A bold claim there. She said conservatism is being challenged from the right now by economic nationalists and populists, but I don't think it's going to be long-lasting. So it's quite... put a chin out there to predict the decline of a certain kind of right-wing populism. However, at an event that our Dan Bloom was at, talking to John Curtis last night, there was a rather different view of all of this. John Curtis, of course, is the much revered polling guru, and he reckoned that Reform and Greens could drop back to about 10% apiece. That was potentially a scenario, but that neither would go away, and that was still hollowing out opportunity in the centre ground, in that battle for control of what we used to call the centre ground between the big parties, and that multi-party politics made it much harder to assemble a coalition that could command a big slice of the electorate. It's almost as if what you were describing there in Scotland and Wales, it could be much more predictive of our politics across the whole of the UK. That was a theme of Dan Bloom talking to Curtis.
That's really interesting. I can tell you two people or groups of people that are really into this idea of multi-party politics, coalition building and all that kind of thing. One is Andy Burnham, who's rather obsessed by progressive coalitions. And the other are the Germans, who just do coalition politics much more naturally and much more easily, I always feel, than the British, which is the perfect segue into your story. We can be quite cheesy at times, can't we? About what happened when you sat down with the new German ambassador and talked about Andy Burnham.
Yeah, that was a great Radio 1 link there, Sam. I sat down. We're auditioning. I sat down with Susanna Baumann, who is the newish German ambassador. It's her first interview since she came into post. This is for the Westminster Insider podcast, which is out tomorrow. One thing I learned is that she had been on a trip to Manchester, sat down with Manchester man himself, Andy Burnham. She praises the revival of the city. She'd known the city at the start of her career when she was a young diplomat in the UK, and she said it was transformed, she felt, and very much sort of praised that kind of northern powerhouse approach and the revival in the northwest. All of that is grist to the Burnham mill, is it not, when it comes to pushing his Manchesterism narrative with his own political stamp on it that you refer to there, and making coalitions, breaking down some of the silos of conventional politics. Baumann also keen to come to the aid of the UK government embattled on defence this week. They might be happy to know they've still got some supporters after those torrid internal rows about defence spending. She said she couldn't imagine a world now in which the UK and Germany didn't deepen their ties. And one thing I was asking her about is this big project that Germany appears to be considering participating in. This is a joint air defence project with Japan, Britain and Italy to develop a next generation fighter jet. It's called GCAP. Now, I should say we're still very much at the smoke signals stage on that, but it would be a very significant integration of air defence if it did get it across the line. And also it would be politically quite useful to the UK and to Keir Starmer and John Healey, because it would replace a project led by France and Germany with Spain to create a fighter jet system, which has run into serious trouble. It's worth watching where that one goes.
It certainly is. Those kind of defence cooperation pacts are incredibly technically complicated, much more complicated than getting the blasted e-gates open at various German airports. I'd like that compatibility, please, to be brought forward. Look, in fairness, we ought to say that in the show notes of the podcast, you can get a guide to all of the candidates standing in all the elections in May. So look that up. Okay, it's local elections time, so it's going to be a busy political weekend. I'll be in Paris tomorrow for Keir Starmer meeting Emmanuel Macron. So it doesn't stop, but we'll be back on Monday. Have a lovely weekend. See you then.
Just your excuse for going to Paris, really, isn't it?